At 4:17 in the morning, the men in the trench were still sharing cigarettes. By sunrise, some of them would be ordered to kill each other. This is one of the strangest realities of war. The person standing beside you can become the person standing across from you, not because either of you suddenly changed, but because borders moved, governments collapsed, alliances shifted, and yesterday's friend was reclassified as today's enemy. We often imagine war as a simple picture, one army on one side, another army on the other. But history is rarely that clean. Armies fracture. Countries change governments. Occupied soldiers are transferred. Former allies discover that their interests were never as permanent as they appeared. And ordinary men can wake up inside a completely different war without ever leaving the same battlefield. To understand how this happens, imagine a soldier who has spent months fighting alongside another unit. They have shared food, ammunition, jokes, fear, and the same narrow strip of ground. They have watched the same artillery shells tear through buildings. They have pulled wounded men from the same rubble. In the chaos of combat, nationality can become strangely distant. Survival comes first. The uniform next to you matters more than the flag printed on a map. Then, one morning, an order arrives. The unit you trusted has been declared hostile. Nothing about the faces across the field has changed. The same rifles are in their hands. The same men may still remember the names of soldiers they fought beside yesterday. Yet the meaning of their uniforms has changed completely. This transformation is not just a story about betrayal. It reveals something much bigger about how wars actually work. Alliances are not friendships between individuals. They are agreements between states, governments, commanders, and strategic interests. When those interests change, millions of people can be forced to inherit the consequences. And sometimes, the change happens with astonishing speed. During the Second World War, this became brutally clear. Germany and the Soviet Union had signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1939, an agreement that shocked much of the world. Behind the scenes, the two powers divided spheres of influence across Eastern Europe. For a time, they were not fighting each other. Then, on June 22, 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa and invaded the Soviet Union. The soldiers on both sides did not wake up with new personalities that morning. The political relationship had changed first. Millions of human beings simply followed the consequences. But the most unsettling examples are not always found at the highest level of government. They appear in the lives of soldiers caught between collapsing loyalties. Consider what happens when an army changes sides. A government may surrender, a new regime may take control, or a former alliance may suddenly become unacceptable. The soldier is then confronted with a terrible choice: obey the new command, resist it, flee, or fight people who were recently considered partners. That is where the clean mythology of war begins to disappear, because the battlefield does not care about yesterday. A soldier may remember that the man opposite him once gave him water. He may remember sitting beside him during a freezing night. He may remember laughing together while waiting for orders. None of those memories disappear when a commander changes the operational map, and yet the order remains. This is why some of the most powerful stories in military history are not really about victories. They are about moments when loyalty becomes impossible to define. Was loyalty to the country, to the government, to the unit, to the commander, or simply to the men who had kept you alive? Those questions become especially dangerous when propaganda enters the picture. Governments need soldiers to believe that the enemy is fundamentally different from them. But soldiers who have fought alongside former enemies have already seen the contradiction. They know that courage exists on both sides. Fear exists on both sides. Families are waiting on both sides. The uncomfortable truth is that war can turn human relationships into strategic liabilities. And once that happens, the most dangerous command may not be advance. It may be turn around. Because behind that command is a question no military manual can answer for you. What do you do when the people you were trained to protect are suddenly the people you are ordered to destroy? The answer, as history shows, can change the course of an entire war. And sometimes, that reversal creates battles no strategist planned. Units hesitate. Commanders distrust one another. Soldiers surrender rather than fire. Others obey, convinced that duty leaves them no alternative. In those moments, the line between ally and enemy stops being a line on a map and becomes a line inside the human mind. And that line can haunt them. One of the clearest examples of this nightmare came in 1943, when Italy changed sides during the Second World War. For 3 years, Italian soldiers had fought alongside Germany against the Allies. Then Benito Mussolini was removed from power. The new Italian government secretly negotiated with the Allies, and on September 8th, Italy announced an armistice. For Italian soldiers, the announcement did not produce clarity. It produced confusion. German forces that had been allies only hours earlier moved to disarm Italian units. Italian commanders received contradictory orders. Some soldiers resisted, others surrendered. Many simply did not know whom they were supposed to obey. Imagine the psychological shock. You have spent years believing that the man wearing a German uniform beside you is an ally. Suddenly, German troops are surrounding your barracks. You are told that your former partner is now a threat. Yet the enemy you fought for years may still be somewhere beyond the front lines. Italy's collapse exposed a brutal weakness in wartime alliances. Soldiers can be prepared for combat, but they cannot be prepared for political reality changing overnight. And the consequences were enormous. Germany responded by occupying much of Italy, disarming Italian forces, and establishing a military presence across the country. Some Italian soldiers joined resistance movements. Others were captured and transported to German-controlled territories. Still others continued fighting, now alongside the Allies. The uniforms changed. The battlefield changed, but memories did not. This pattern appeared elsewhere in the war, sometimes on an even larger scale. Countries could move from cooperation to confrontation because leaders calculated that yesterday's arrangement no longer served tomorrow's objectives. That is the part modern audiences often underestimate. We tend to think of alliances as promises based on trust. In international politics, they are usually calculations based on interests. A government asks a simple question: does this relationship help us survive? If the answer changes, the relationship can change with it. During the war, this logic produced strange combinations. Nations with radically different political systems sometimes cooperated against a common enemy. Democracies worked with dictatorships. Governments that distrusted one another supplied weapons, intelligence, fuel, and soldiers to the same coalition. They did not suddenly become ideological friends. They discovered that a larger threat temporarily outweighed their differences. But temporary cooperation carries a hidden danger. When the common enemy weakens, the old disagreements return. That happened as the Second World War moved toward its final years. The alliance between the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union was powerful because all three faced Nazi Germany. Yet their visions for Europe were fundamentally different. Once Germany was defeated, the question was no longer how to destroy the common enemy. It was who would shape the peace that followed. The answer created the Cold War. Former partners became strategic rivals. Troops who had once fought on the same side now stood behind opposing borders. Intelligence services that had exchanged information became locked in a contest of espionage. Nations that had coordinated military operations began preparing for the possibility of fighting each other. No single gunshot started this transformation. It happened through suspicion. One side feared expansion. The other feared encirclement. Each interpreted the other's defensive actions as offensive preparations. Every military base looked threatening. Every new alliance looked like a trap. This is how another strange phenomenon emerges: the security paradox. A country may build weapons because it feels unsafe. Its rival sees those weapons and becomes less safe. The rival responds by building weapons. The first country interprets that response as proof that its fears were justified. Neither side necessarily wants war. Yet both sides can become more prepared for it. The same logic can operate inside armies and coalitions. A commander may distrust an allied unit because its government is becoming unreliable. That commander strengthens defenses. The allied unit notices the change and assumes betrayal is coming. It prepares accordingly. Soon, actions designed to prevent conflict begin creating the conditions for conflict. And sometimes, political leaders deliberately exploit that fear. Propaganda can transform uncertainty into certainty. A former ally is no longer described as a partner with different interests. He becomes a traitor, a collaborator, a threat. Once that language takes hold, compromise begins to look like weakness. For ordinary soldiers, this creates an impossible psychological burden. They are asked to compress complicated politics into a command, friend or enemy. But history refuses to stay that simple. The men receiving those orders often know something their governments cannot erase. Yesterday's enemy may have been today's ally, and tomorrow's enemy may once again become today's partner. That realization changes how we understand loyalty itself. Because perhaps the most frightening thing about war is not that people hate one another. It is that they can be taught to fight people they never hated at all. The story becomes even more disturbing when the change of sides happens during a battle, because then there is no time for politics to explain itself. Orders arrive through damaged radios. Messengers cross roads under fire. Commanders argue over which instructions are legitimate. And somewhere below them, exhausted soldiers are trying to understand why the people beside them are suddenly pointing guns in their direction. One of the most dramatic examples came in the final stages of the Second World War, when German forces attempted to hold territory that was already collapsing around them. Across Europe, alliances were shifting, governments were falling, and entire armies were being reorganized. Soldiers could find themselves surrounded by forces whose political identities had changed faster than military intelligence could keep track. But there was another layer to this chaos: prisoners. Imagine being captured by an army that had been your enemy, only to discover that your own government has now become its partner. The label attached to you can change before your physical circumstances do. Yesterday you were an enemy combatant. Today you might be a potential ally. Tomorrow, depending on politics, you might be treated as a collaborator or a traitor. For millions of people caught inside these transformations, survival depended on understanding politics they had never been trained to understand. This is why the history of changing alliances cannot be separated from the history of identity. A soldier does not carry only a weapon. He carries a story about who he is fighting for. That story may come from school books, newspapers, family, religion, national myths, military training, or years of propaganda. When the government changes its enemy, the soldier is being asked to rewrite that story almost instantly. Some can do it. Some cannot. Others discover that their deepest loyalty was never to a government at all. It was to the people standing beside them. That distinction became especially important in resistance movements. Across occupied Europe, individuals who had once served governments, armies, or political systems sometimes joined underground organizations when those systems collapsed or became unacceptable. Former soldiers could become resistance fighters. Former collaborators could become enemies of the regime they had previously supported. Civilians could find themselves fighting neighbors because they believed their political loyalties had changed. The battlefield had moved into ordinary life, and that is where the consequences became personal. A roadblock was no longer simply a military position. It could separate families. A uniform could determine whether someone was arrested, protected, imprisoned, or killed. A former friendship could become evidence of collaboration. A former enemy could become the person hiding you from a new regime. War had turned relationships into political statements. Yet there is an important lesson hidden inside this chaos. The most durable alliances are rarely built only on emotion. They are built on shared interests, institutions, communication, and a believable reason for continuing together after circumstances change. Without those foundations, cooperation can disappear remarkably quickly. This explains why modern military alliances spend enormous effort on joint exercises, shared command structures, intelligence coordination, standardized equipment, and political consultation. The purpose is not merely to make armies fight better. It is to make them understand one another before a crisis arrives. Because uncertainty is dangerous. If soldiers know exactly who is authorized to give orders, what happens when a government changes, and how allied forces will respond to a political crisis, the possibility of sudden betrayal becomes smaller. But no system can eliminate it completely. Politics remains unpredictable. Governments change. Leaders die. Elections alter foreign policy. Sometimes ordinary soldiers are trapped by decisions made thousands of miles away. And sometimes the people who were enemies yesterday become partners again because another threat appears. The cycle can repeat. That may be the most unsettling lesson of all. In war, yesterday is never a guarantee of tomorrow. But if yesterday's ally can become tomorrow's enemy, what happens after the shooting stops? The answer is often more complicated than anyone expects. When a war ends, governments can sign treaties, redraw borders, exchange prisoners, and declare peace. But soldiers do not simply erase the people they once fought beside. The memory remains. Sometimes it becomes bitterness, sometimes shame. Sometimes it becomes a strange form of respect. And occasionally, former enemies discover that the people they were ordered to hate were never as different as they had been told. That is why the aftermath of war can be just as revealing as the battlefield itself. Consider the soldiers who survived the Second World War. Many returned home carrying memories that could not easily be explained to civilians. Some had fought against men who were, only years earlier, considered allies. Others had fought alongside people whose governments eventually became their enemies. They had witnessed borders move, regimes collapse, and political loyalties reverse. For them, history was not a sequence of dates. It was personal. A date meant the morning an order changed. A country meant the face of a prisoner. An alliance meant the man who once shared ammunition with you. Betrayal meant a former partner appearing through a rifle sight. This is where the traditional image of war begins to fail. Wars are usually taught as contests between nations, but nations are abstractions. They do not experience fear. They do not freeze in a trench. They do not wonder whether an order is morally right. People do, and people remember. That memory can influence politics long after the weapons are silent. Former enemies sometimes become allies again because geography does not change simply because governments do. Countries that fought each other may eventually discover that they face a new threat, share economic interests, or need one another for security. Yesterday's battlefield can become tomorrow's diplomatic meeting room. The transformation can seem almost impossible when viewed from inside the war. Imagine telling a soldier in the middle of a brutal campaign that, decades later, his former enemy might become a treaty partner. He might not believe you. Yet history repeatedly demonstrates that international relationships are not permanent friendships or permanent hatreds. They are constantly reconstructed around changing circumstances. This is especially important in a world where economic power, technology, energy, trade, and military strength are deeply connected. A country can compete with another nation economically while cooperating with it militarily. It can depend on a rival for critical resources while preparing defenses against that same rival. It can condemn another government publicly while negotiating privately. The contradiction is not an accident. It is international politics. And once you understand that, the stories of soldiers suddenly becoming enemies look different. The soldiers were not necessarily betraying each other. The system around them was changing. That does not make the violence less tragic. In some ways, it makes it more tragic because it shows how much ordinary people can be forced to carry the consequences of decisions they never made. A government can sign an agreement in a distant capital. A general can issue an order from headquarters. A diplomat can redraw a relationship with a signature. But the soldier at the front may have only seconds to understand what any of it means. That imbalance is one of the darkest features of organized warfare. Those who make strategic decisions are often farthest from the immediate consequences. Those who experience the consequences usually have the least control over the decisions. And yet, despite everything, soldiers continue to form bonds. They share food. They rescue wounded comrades. They protect strangers. They sometimes show mercy to enemies. These moments survive because they reveal something politics cannot completely control. Human beings recognize other human beings, even across uniforms, even across borders, even across years of propaganda. Perhaps that is why stories of former allies becoming enemies remain so haunting. They force us to confront a truth that is uncomfortable in every era. The distance between friendship and hostility may be much smaller than we think. A government can change its policy overnight. A treaty can become worthless. A border can move. A commander can issue a new order. But the human memory of who stood beside you does not disappear with the paperwork. And that leaves us with a final question. When history tells us that one nation defeated another, that one alliance collapsed, or that former partners became enemies, are we really hearing the whole story? Maybe not. Because beneath every strategic decision were individuals trying to survive a world that kept changing around them. Perhaps that is the real lesson of this story. In war, enemies are not always born enemies. Sometimes they are created by decisions made far above the battlefield, by governments, alliances, borders, and circumstances that can change overnight. The soldier is simply left to live with the consequences. History reminds us that yesterday's ally can become tomorrow's enemy, and tomorrow's enemy can eventually become a partner again. The uniforms may change, the flags may change, and the orders may change, but the human beings underneath them remain remarkably similar. If you found this story fascinating, subscribe to the channel for more forgotten moments, hidden stories, and unexpected turning points from history. And tell us in the comments. If you discovered that the person fighting beside you yesterday had suddenly become your enemy today, would you follow the order or would you hesitate?